The wind howled like a wild beast across the endless Wyoming plains, sweeping snow in blinding sheets that turned the world into a white void. The year was 1912, and winter had laid its claim with a merciless grip. The last train of the evening had long since vanished into the storm, leaving behind only silence and the faint echo of its whistle carried by the wind. At the tiny wooden station of Clearwater Junction, a young woman sat huddled on a bench, clutching her worn leather satchel to her chest. Clara Bennett, a nurse from Chicago, had been traveling west to take up a post at a small mining town hospital. But now her plans, and perhaps her life, were in peril. The station master had left hours ago, shaking his head and locking up before the storm worsened. He'd offered Clara a ride to the nearest inn, but the coach was already full. "Best wait for the morning train, miss," he'd said kindly. "Storm will break by dawn." But dawn never came. Only darker clouds and heavier snow. Clara wrapped her woolen coat tighter around her thin frame, but the cold crept through every layer like icy fingers. Her breath puffed out in faint clouds, fading quickly into the air. Her gloves were damp, her boots soaked. She had tried to keep her spirits high, reciting prayers, humming hymns, but now her voice trembled and faltered. Her mind drifted to Chicago, the warm glow of street lamps, her tiny room above the apothecary, her father's old watch ticking softly by her bedside. He had always said she was brave, strong enough to face any storm. But tonight, as frost gathered on her lashes, she felt anything but brave. She stood and moved toward the door, hoping to find shelter inside the small waiting room. The hinges groaned as she pushed it open, and a gust of wind nearly knocked her backward. The interior was no better. Cold air seeped through the cracks in the walls, and the dying fire in the corner stove had long turned to ash. Clara sank to the wooden floor near the stove and pressed her hands together for warmth. Her vision blurred. Every sound seemed distant now, the wind, the creak of the roof, the beating of her own heart. "I'll just rest for a moment," she whispered to no one, her words slurring as sleep pulled at her heavy eyelids. She leaned her head against the wall, and the world began to fade. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the station in silence. The lantern by the platform flickered once, then went out completely. Hours passed before the faint rhythm of hooves broke the quiet. A horse emerged through the swirling snow, its rider hunched low against the wind. Eli Walker, a weather-beaten cowboy in his early 30s, was returning from a cattle drive. He had ridden nearly 30 miles in the storm, searching for shelter. When he saw the dark outline of the station, he urged his horse forward. The sight that met him inside stopped him cold. A young woman lay slumped beside the cold stove, her skin pale as the snow outside. Her hair, the color of chestnut, spilled across her shoulders like frozen silk. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice rough but gentle. No response. He knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A faint pulse, weak but there. Relief flooded through him. "Hang on, miss," he murmured, wrapping his heavy wool coat around her trembling body. "You're not dying out here tonight. Not if I can help it." He lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest as if she were made of glass. With a quick whistle, his horse came forward. Snow swirled around them as Eli mounted up, holding her close to shield her from the wind, and into the blizzard they rode. One man, one woman, and a fragile spark of life, toward a cabin somewhere in the white wilderness, where fate had already written the next chapter of their story. The snow fell thicker as Eli Walker pressed his horse onward, the world around him vanishing into a swirling sea of white. The wind stung his face, the cold biting through his coat like knives, but he held the woman close, shielding her fragile body with his own. Each breath came out in a white cloud, and every step of his horse felt heavier than the last. "Just a little farther, girl," he murmured to his mare Daisy, patting her neck. "You've carried us through worse. Don't fail me now." The horse snorted and trudged forward through knee-deep snow. The weight in Eli's arms stirred slightly. A faint sound escaped the woman's lips. A soft whimper. She was alive, but barely. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyelashes frozen, her pulse weak as a whisper. "Hold on," he said under his breath, his voice breaking in the storm. I'm getting you home. Home. The word carried a warmth he hadn't felt in years. His small cabin sat 5 miles west, tucked between a grove of firs and the frozen creek. It wasn't much, just a roof, a hearth, and 4 sturdy walls. But tonight, it might be the difference between life and death. By the time he reached the clearing, Eli could feel the numbness creeping into his own fingers. The mare stumbled once, then pushed on, her hooves crunching on the frozen path. When the outline of the cabin finally appeared through the veil of snow, Eli muttered a prayer of thanks. He slid off the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the drift, and carried the woman to the door. Kicking it open with his heel, he stepped inside, bringing a gust of icy air with him. The cabin was dark and cold. He hadn't lit a fire before leaving 2 days earlier. But it was shelter. He laid her gently on the bed and went straight to work. Eli tore off his gloves and reached for the flint and tinder. Within moments, flames crackled in the hearth, casting an amber glow across the room. He fetched water from the bucket, warmed it, and soaked a cloth to press against her frost-bitten hands. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. He checked her pulse again, still weak, but steadier. He poured a little whiskey into a tin cup, mixed it with warm water, and touched it to her lips. "Drink, miss," he said softly. "Just a sip." Her lips twitched, and she swallowed a drop. Then her eyes fluttered open. Confused and frightened, she stared at the strange man hovering over her. The rugged lines of his face, the scruff of a beard, the worried softness in his blue eyes. Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe," he replied gently. "Name's Eli Walker. Found you half frozen at the station. The train. I was waiting for the train." He nodded, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "No train's coming through that storm, miss. You're lucky I passed by when I did." Her gaze darted around the cabin, the flickering fire, the rough-hewn walls, the saddle by the door. She tried to sit up, but weakness overcame her. Eli steadied her gently, his hands rough but careful. "Easy now. Rest a spell. You'll be all right." For a moment, silence filled the room, except for the crackle of the fire. The storm outside raged on, but inside, warmth began to return, to her body and to the space between them. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Eli gave a faint, lopsided smile. "Don't thank me yet. You'll need more than fire and coffee to get through this night." He sat back beside the hearth, feeding the flames higher. In that tiny cabin, surrounded by snow and darkness, fate had drawn 2 lonely souls together. Neither knew it yet, but the storm outside was only the beginning of something far greater, a love story born from ice, destined to outlast the cold. The fire crackled and hissed in the stone hearth, filling the small cabin with flickering light. The warmth slowly began to chase away the shadows that clung to the corners. Eli Walker knelt near the bed, his brows furrowed in concentration as he wrung out another warm cloth. "The young woman, Clara Bennett," she'd said in a trembling voice before slipping back into half-consciousness, lay wrapped in every blanket he could find. Yet still she shivered. Her lips were pale, her fingers stiff, and her cheeks as cold as marble. Frostbite. He'd seen it before, out on the range, among cowhands caught in blizzards. It could take a man's fingers, his toes, even his life. He wasn't about to let it take hers. "Come on now, Clara," he murmured, rubbing her hands between his rough palms. "You've got to fight. Don't you quit on me." The wind outside beat against the cabin walls, but inside, time slowed to the rhythm of the fire and her faint breathing. Eli moved with care, warming stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth and tucking them near her feet. He'd done this once for a friend who nearly froze to death on a cattle drive. It was a cruel process, but it worked. After an hour, a trace of color began to return to Clara's cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered open again, dazed and heavy. "Where am I?" she whispered. "In my cabin," Eli said gently, setting aside the cloth. "Found you at Clearwater Station. You were half buried in snow. Lucky I came along." Her eyes darted toward the door, then to the window, as if still expecting the train to appear through the storm. "The nurse train. It never came, no ma'am." "Train ain't coming till that storm's done with us," he replied. "You'll stay here till then." Ain't no safer place for miles, Clara hesitated. Her voice trembled as she said, You live here alone? Eli nodded, stirring the fire. Been that way for a few years now. Just me and Daisy. Daisy? He pointed toward the stable outside the window. My horse. Best company a man can ask for. Don't talk much, but she listens fine. A faint smile touched her lips before exhaustion pulled her back down. Eli watched her for a long moment, his heart heavier than he cared to admit. He'd known plenty of women in saloons and towns, but this one, this pale, half-frozen stranger, felt different. Maybe it was the quiet courage in her eyes when she'd first woken, or maybe it was how fragile she looked and yet how fiercely she held on to life. Hours passed. Eli dozed in a chair beside the bed, his hat tipped low over his face. The fire burned low, but the storm outside began to ease, its fury fading into soft, whispering snow. In the early dawn, Clara stirred again. Her voice was stronger this time. Mr. Walker. He lifted his head. You're awake. That's a good sign. Did you stay up all night? She asked weakly. Someone had to make sure you didn't freeze again, he said simply. Would have been a shame to lose you after all that work. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes softening. Then I owe you my life. Eli shifted uncomfortably. Don't reckon you owe me a thing, miss. Just glad I got there in time. The light from the fire glowed between them, painting the room in amber and gold. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a faint pink hue over the snow. The storm had finally passed, but something new had begun to stir in the warmth of that cabin, a fragile bond, small and uncertain, but alive. Eli poured her a cup of warm broth, handed it over carefully, and met her eyes for the first real time. Rest easy, Clara, he said quietly. You're safe now, I promise. And in that promise, unspoken yet powerful, the foundation of their story, born from the blizzard, was set in motion. The storm finally broke the next morning, leaving behind a world hushed under a blanket of snow. The air outside was sharp and clear, the sky a pale blue streaked with the faint blush of dawn. Inside Eli Walker's cabin, the fire still burned low, filling the room with a soft amber warmth. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint aroma of coffee brewing in a dented tin pot. Clara Bennett awoke slowly, her body still weak but no longer trembling. She blinked, letting her eyes adjust to the light streaming through the frosted window. The room was small but neat, rough wooden beams overhead, a sturdy table, shelves lined with tools and books, and a single rocking chair by the fire. She sat up, the thick wool blanket slipping from her shoulders, and saw Eli at the stove, his back turned. He wore a worn flannel shirt and suspenders, his dark hair messy from sleep. Despite his ruggedness, there was a quiet gentleness in the way he moved. When he turned and saw her awake, his stern expression softened. Morning, he said simply, pouring a mug of coffee. You look better than you did last night. I was starting to think I'd have to bury you out back. Clara gave a faint laugh, her first in days. You have a morbid sense of humor, Mr. Walker. He grinned slightly. Keeps a man company out here. She accepted the mug he offered, the heat of it seeping into her cold hands. The rich, bitter taste reminded her she was alive. For a few moments neither spoke, listening only to the crackling fire and the distant drip of melting snow from the roof. Finally, Clara said quietly, I suppose I owe you an apology. I was frightened when I woke up yesterday. I thought that I'd kidnapped you. Eli interrupted, amused. Wouldn't be the first time someone's thought that of me. Can't blame you. Strange man, strange cabin, middle of a snowstorm. It don't look right. She smiled shyly. Well, it seems I was wrong. You've been nothing but kind. Eli leaned back in the chair, studying her face. You're not from around here. Chicago, right? Her eyes widened. How did you... The way you talk, he said with a smirk. Proper. Careful with your words. Ain't the sound of the frontier, Clara nodded slowly. Yes, I was raised there. I'm a nurse, or at least I was. After my father died, I joined a charity program sending nurses west. I thought I could do some good. Brave thing, he said, his tone respectful. Most city folks don't last a week out here. I didn't last one night at a train station, she replied softly. Eli chuckled. You lasted because you fought. That's more than most. The conversation eased something between them, two lonely souls who had lived too long with silence. Over the next few days, as the snow outside began to thaw, they fell into a rhythm. Clara, though still weak, insisted on helping where she could, mending Eli's torn shirts, cooking simple meals, tidying the cabin. In return, Eli showed her how to split kindling, feed Daisy, and saddle a horse. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Clara told stories of hospital wards filled with coughing men during the Chicago epidemic, of loss and heartbreak and perseverance. Eli spoke little of his past, but when he did, his words were heavy, his family's ranch lost to debt, his younger brother buried after a riding accident. Their pain met in the quiet spaces between their words. One night, when the fire burned low, Eli pulled out a small harmonica and played a slow, wistful tune. The melody floated through the cabin like a memory. Clara closed her eyes, tears tracing her cheeks. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Old trail song," he said softly. "Played it for my ma once. Thought maybe it'd sound better tonight." In that tender silence, something shifted between them, something delicate and real. Outside, the snow sparkled beneath the moonlight, and inside, the walls of solitude that had surrounded both their hearts began to melt away. Days slipped quietly into weeks, and the snow that once sealed them inside began to soften under the first hint of spring. The long winter silence that had once felt suffocating now carried a strange peace. Inside Eli Walker's cabin, life had found its rhythm, steady, warm, and quietly intimate. Clara Bennett had regained her strength, though a faint weariness still clung to her. Each morning she would rise before Eli, stoke the fire, and boil water for coffee. He'd emerge soon after, boots thudding against the wooden floor, always with a gentle, "Mornin', Miss Bennett." She'd smile and hand him a mug, pretending not to notice the way his voice seemed softer when he said her name. Their days were simple. They shoveled snow from the roof, hauled water from the frozen creek, and fed Daisy, who had grown fond of Clara's quiet pats and murmured thanks. At night they cooked over the fire, beans, biscuits, and occasionally the trout Eli caught through a hole in the ice. Conversation came easily now, flowing between them like the slow thaw of the world outside. Yet beneath the small talk and laughter, there lingered something neither dared to name. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara stood by the window, watching the last light fade over the snow. Eli sat at the table, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird. The steady scrape of his knife against the grain filled the silence. "You're awfully quiet tonight," he said without looking up. "I was just thinking," she replied softly. "When I left Chicago, I thought I'd find purpose. But all I've found so far is stillness." He glanced up, his blue eyes meeting hers. Sometimes stillness is what folks are meant to find. City people spend their whole lives running. Out here, you learn to listen, to the wind, the fire, even your own heart. She smiled faintly. "And what does your heart say, Mr. Walker?" He hesitated, knife pausing mid-stroke. "It says not everything needs speaking." Clara turned back to the window, pretending to be absorbed by the snowfall, but her cheeks burned. She didn't need him to say more. The silence between them was alive, filled with the unspoken language of shared glances, quiet gestures, and moments that lingered longer than they should. In the days that followed, that bond deepened in small, wordless ways. When she caught him mending the tear in her coat, she noticed how carefully he stitched the fabric, as if afraid to hurt it. When she fell asleep reading by the fire, she awoke with a blanket draped over her shoulders. And sometimes, when their hands brushed while passing a cup or working side by side, the touch sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. One night, as the storm clouds gathered again, Eli pulled out his harmonica. The tune was the same one he had played before, low and wistful, but this time it carried something deeper, something that reached her soul. Clara closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When the final note faded, she whispered, "That song. It sounds like longing." He looked at her across the firelight. "Maybe it is." For a moment, neither moved. The fire popped, and the wind sighed through the cracks in the cabin walls. She wanted to cross the room, to take his hand, to tell him that she felt it too. That same quiet longing. But propriety, fear, and the fragile balance they had built held her back. Instead, she said softly, "It's beautiful." Eli gave a small nod. "So are you, Clara." The words hung between them, fragile and trembling, before he looked away. She felt her heart stutter in her chest. Neither spoke again that night. But when she lay in bed, the sound of the harmonica still echoed in her mind, and in that melody, she heard the truth both of them were too afraid to say aloud. The snow continued to melt, revealing the earth beneath. Yet in that cabin, surrounded by the fading winter, a love unspoken began to bloom, quiet, patient, and inevitable. The morning came soft and silver, with sunlight glinting on the last patches of melting snow. The storm that had once seemed endless had finally given way to spring's first breath. Birds began to return to the trees, and the creek near the cabin murmured again beneath a crust of thinning ice. Inside, Clara moved quietly, packing her small satchel with trembling hands. The distant sound of a train whistle had reached them at dawn, a faint, haunting cry that cut through the mountains like a memory. It was the first train in weeks, finally running after the snow-cleared tracks. For Clara, it was the sound of duty calling her back to the world she had left behind. For Eli, it was the sound of something precious about to slip away. She folded her shawl neatly, her heart heavy. The past month in the cabin had been a life she hadn't expected. Peaceful, simple, and filled with a quiet affection that felt deeper than any she'd known. Eli had saved her life, but more than that, he had reminded her what it meant to live. He stood by the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching her. "Didn't figure the train'd come through so soon," he said, his voice low. She forced a smile. "I suppose it means the world is turning again. The hospital at Pine Ridge will need me." Eli nodded, but didn't answer right away. He leaned against the frame, eyes fixed on the fire burning low in the hearth. Their fire, built every morning together, now reduced to faint embers. "I reckon they do," he said finally. "You've got folks waiting on you. You do good work." The words were meant to sound steady, but they cracked around the edges. Clara turned to face him, her hands clutching her satchel. "You've been more than kind to me, mister. Walker, I owe you—" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "You don't owe me nothing, Clara. Not a soul owes me a thing." His voice held a finality that made her throat tighten. She took a hesitant step closer. "Then, at least let me thank you properly." He met her gaze, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The air between them seemed to hum with all the words neither of them had spoken. Gratitude, affection, the ache of parting. Eli finally looked away, clearing his throat. "Train'll be at Clearwater in an hour. I'll saddle Daisy and ride you there." The ride through the thawing valley was quiet. The sun glimmered on the snowmelt, turning the land into a patchwork of light and shadow. Clara clung to the saddle, behind him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his back. She wanted to memorize it, the scent of pine on his coat, the warmth of his body, the way his hair caught the wind. When they reached the station, the train was already waiting, black smoke curling lazily into the sky. A few passengers were boarding, their voices echoing faintly in the thin air. Eli dismounted and helped her down. For a moment, neither moved. Clara held her satchel against her chest, her eyes glistening. "I suppose this is goodbye," she said softly. He nodded once. "Reckon it is." A silence settled between them, fragile and heavy. Then suddenly, she stepped forward, and pressed her gloved hand into his. "I'll never forget what you did for me." Eli's fingers closed around hers, warm, rough, steady. "Just promise me one thing, Clara." "What's that?" He swallowed hard. "Don't let that big city take the fire out of you. You've got too much light for a place that cold." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "And you've got too much heart for a man to live out here alone." Before either could say more, the conductor's call echoed across the platform. She turned away, her heart pounding, and climbed aboard. Through the window, she saw him lift his hat in farewell, standing tall against the wide Wyoming sky. As the train pulled away, Clara pressed her hand to the glass, watching his figure grow, smaller until it disappeared completely into the horizon. She whispered into the hum of the wheels, "Goodbye, Eli Walker." But deep inside, she knew it wasn't truly goodbye. Some bonds, born in fire and snow, can't be broken by distance or time. The train rumbled across the Wyoming plains, carrying Clara Bennett farther from the snowbound cabin that had come to feel like home. She sat by the window, watching the landscape blur past, the white fields giving way to gray towns and eventually to the rugged ridges of the mining valley where her new life awaited. Yet no matter how far the wheels carried her, her thoughts lingered behind. In the warmth of a fire-lit cabin, in the quiet strength of a cowboy's eyes. When she arrived in Pine Ridge, the small mining town buzzed with the clatter of wagons and the smell of coal smoke. Men trudged through the streets in heavy boots, faces smudged with soot. The little hospital at the end of the road stood half empty, its roof patched with tin and its windows rattling in the wind. The matron, Mrs. Hargreaves, greeted her briskly. "You'll find no rest here, Miss Bennett," she said, leading her inside. "The miners work hard and fall harder. We're short on hands and shorter on supplies." Clara nodded, her resolve firm. "I'm ready to work, ma'am," and work she did. From dawn until long past dusk, Clara tended to the sick and injured, setting broken bones, dressing wounds, comforting feverish children. Her hands never stopped. But at night, when the halls fell silent, her mind drifted back to Eli Walker. She would see him in her dreams sometimes, standing in the doorway of the cabin, his hat in his hands, that soft smile touching his lips. She'd wake to find tears on her cheeks and the ache of something missing deep in her chest. In those lonely months, Clara began writing letters, one after another, addressed simply to Eli Walker, Clearwater Valley. She poured her heart into each page, telling him of her work, her fears, her longing. But each time she finished, she folded the letter neatly, tied it with a bit of twine, and tucked it away in the drawer by her bedside. She never sent them. "Foolish," she whispered to herself one night. "He's a man of the plains. I'm a nurse in a mining town. What could come of it?" But love, once awakened, does not sleep easily. Far away, in that same valley, Eli returned to his old life. The days stretched into long, quiet hours, spent repairing fences, tending to the herd, and patching up the cabin's leaky roof. The snow melted into streams, the grass grew tall again, and yet the silence around him felt heavier than before. He'd ride out to the ridge sometimes at dusk, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the same horizon that had swallowed the train carrying Clara away. In his hand, he'd hold the small wooden bird he had carved for her but never given. Its wings were smooth beneath his thumb, polished by restless hours of thought. "Reckon she's back east by now," he muttered one evening, tossing a pebble into the creek. City life suits her better in this old dust, but he didn't believe his own words. Every night, he found himself looking at the empty chair across the fire, hearing her laughter echo faintly in the walls. The cabin had once been a place of solitude. Now it was haunted by memory. When he rode into town for supplies, people noticed the change in him. "Walker," the blacksmith said, "you look like a man who's lost something he can't name." Eli just smiled faintly. "Maybe I found something instead, just ain't got it no more." Through the summer and into autumn, their lives ran parallel, hers filled with duty and healing, his with toil and silence. Yet somewhere beneath the same vast sky, their hearts beat in rhythm. Bound by a promise neither had spoken aloud, and though the distance between them stretched for miles, neither truly believed the story was over. Because love born in the cold doesn't melt with the snow. It waits, quiet and patient, for the next storm to bring it back again. By the time the first chill of autumn crept into Pine Ridge, life in the mining town had settled into a weary rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of coal dust, and the coughs of miners echoed through the narrow streets. Clara Bennett had grown used to exhaustion, her days spent tending to bruises, burns, and broken bones, her nights lit by the dim glow of an oil lamp as she mixed tinctures and cleaned blood-stained linens. But one morning, she noticed something different. A miner named Tom Avery, who had come in with a simple fever the day before, now lay drenched in sweat, his skin pale and his breath labored. "It's not just the cold," Clara murmured, feeling his burning forehead. "Something's spreading." By the next week, half the bunkhouse was coughing. Fever, chills, bleeding gums. The townsfolk whispered the word plague, though no one dared say it too loud. The little hospital filled to bursting, and Clara worked until her hands trembled from fatigue. Mrs. Hargreaves, the head nurse, collapsed on the third night. After that, Clara was left alone to manage the chaos. Days bled into nights. The smell of sickness clung to her hair and clothes. Still, she refused to rest. She boiled water, mixed poultices, and whispered prayers over the dying. Her strength waned, but her spirit held firm, until her own body began to falter. It started with a cough. Then dizziness. Then, one evening, as she bent to lift a basin of water, her knees buckled. The room tilted, the world spun, and darkness swallowed her. She fell hard, the sound of breaking glass echoing faintly before everything went silent. When she opened her eyes again, the light was dim, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, not of disinfectant or medicine. A familiar rough voice broke through the haze. "Well, look who decided to wake up." Her eyes fluttered open fully, and she gasped. Eli Walker sat by her bedside, his hat resting on the table, his face lined with worry and fatigue. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. "Eli?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. How are you here?" He smiled faintly, though his eyes shone with relief. "Came down with a load of cattle. Heard Pine Ridge was short on medicine and men. Didn't expect to find you lying here looking half dead again." A laugh caught in her throat, turning to a cough. "I suppose you've saved me twice now." Eli reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "Seems like a habit I can't break." Over the next few days he stayed by her side. He tended the fires, brought her water, and kept watch through the long, fevered nights. When she slept, he sat quietly, carving small wooden figures, birds, horses, even a nurse with a tiny bonnet. He spoke softly to her, telling stories of the open plains, of spring calves and wild mustangs, his voice the anchor that kept her tethered to life. When Clara finally gained enough strength to sit up, she saw him asleep in the chair, his head bowed, exhaustion etched into his features. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He stirred, and their eyes met. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "It's dangerous," Eli shook his head. "Can't think of a place I'd rather be." For the first time in months, Clara smiled. A tired, fragile smile, but real. Around them, the fever still raged outside, but within that small hospital room, there was peace. Together, they faced the long nights that followed, tending to the sick side by side. His strength and her skill became the heart of the town's recovery. And when the outbreak finally began to fade, Pine Ridge whispered about the cowboy and the nurse who fought the sickness together, two souls bound by courage and something deeper than either could yet name. As the last of the fevered patients began to heal, Clara looked at Eli, standing in the doorway with the setting sun behind him, and realized that fate, stubborn, wild, and kind, had brought him back to her. The outbreak had finally passed. The chill of winter was returning, but this time it brought not despair, only quiet and healing. Pine Ridge was still scarred by what had happened. Too many homes bore the marks of loss. Too many graves stood freshly carved on the hillside. Yet in the midst of that sorrow, life began to stir again. The townsfolk spoke in hushed reverence of the nurse and the cowboy, the pair who had fought side by side through the darkest nights. Clara Bennett and Eli Walker had become inseparable, though neither spoke aloud what their hearts already knew. The small hospital had grown silent once more. Clara sat by the window, mending a torn blanket, her hands finally steady after weeks of exhaustion. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter, miners' children playing in the thawing snow. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to rest. Eli appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the fading afternoon light. His hat was tipped low, a smile tugging at his lips. "You keep mending things that ain't yours," he drawled softly. "Town's gonna start sending you every broken soul they got." Clara looked up, amused. "They already do, Mr. Walker." He stepped inside, removing his hat, his gaze lingering on her face. There was a gentleness in his eyes that words couldn't touch. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "you ever think about leaving this place? You've done your part. Could go anywhere now. City, big hospital, maybe back east where it's safer." She paused, needle halfway through the cloth. "And where would I go that doesn't carry a piece of this place with me?" Eli hesitated. "Didn't think you'd want to stay in a dusty mining town," she smiled faintly. "A place isn't made of dust, Eli. It's made of the people who give it meaning." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was warm, thick with unspoken understanding. Then Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if caught in flight. "I made this," he said quietly, placing it in her hand. "Was meaning to give it to you that day at the station, but, well, guess I lost my nerve." Clara ran her fingers over the smooth surface, the familiar texture of his handiwork. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Thing is," he said, taking a slow breath, "I carved another one just like it, kept it back home. Figured maybe they were a pair, like us. One lost, one waitin'. Always meant to find each other again." Her eyes softened. "Eli, I ain't a rich man," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't got fancy ways. But if you'll have me, I'll build you a home out there in the valley. With the sunrise coming through the window and the sound of the creek running by. I'll make you coffee every morning, and I'll never let you face another storm alone." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She stood, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "Eli Walker," she said softly, "you already saved my life twice. Maybe it's time I saved yours by giving you a reason to stop riding off alone." He smiled, a deep, soul-settling smile, and pulled her close. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and steady, as though the sky itself was blessing their promise. In that small, forgotten town beneath the creak of old timbers and the soft hush of winter, a cowboy and a nurse found the courage to name what had always been between them. It wasn't the kind of love that blazed like fire. It was the kind that endured like the earth itself, quiet, strong, unbreakable. That night, under the light of the stars, Eli took her hand and whispered, "From now till the end of every winter," and Clara answered, "Then we'll meet every spring." Their promise was simple, but it was forever. Years passed, and the world beyond Clearwater Valley continued to change, but time seemed to move more gently within its wide, wind-swept plains. The cabin by the creek, once lonely and cold, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and life. Clara Bennett, now Clara Walker, had kept her promise. She and Eli built their home together, board by board, dream by dream, until it stood as a quiet testament to their love, a place shaped by hardship, hope, and healing. Each morning, the first light of dawn streamed through the window, glinting off the kettle on the stove. The scent of coffee mingled with the sweet grass drifting in from outside. Eli would be up before sunrise, tending to the horses, while Clara moved softly through the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, a calm smile playing on her lips. They had no riches, but they had each other, and that, Clara often said, was a kind of wealth that never runs dry. The people of Pine Ridge had not forgotten them either. The townsfolk came often, miners with new injuries, mothers seeking help for their children. Travelers passing through who had heard the story of the nurse who fought the plague and the cowboy who never left her side. Clara kept a small clinic in the cabin's spare room, and Eli helped however he could, carving splints and fetching herbs from the nearby woods. Together, they became the valley's quiet guardians. In the spring, the wildflowers grew thick along the hillside, and Clara would ride out with Eli to gather herbs and watch the sun melt the last traces of snow. Sometimes they would pause at the ridge overlooking the old train tracks where they had first met, where a freezing nurse had stumbled into the arms of a stranger who would change her life. Eli would point to the horizon and say, half teasing, "If that train hadn't stopped that night, reckon you'd never have found me." And Clara would smile. "No, Eli, I think I would have found you somehow. The heart always finds what it's meant to keep." Years rolled on. The valley grew busier as more settlers arrived, and the legend of the cowboy and the nurse spread far beyond the region. Newspapers wrote of them once, a love story that began in a snowstorm and endured every trial that followed. But to Eli and Clara, those words were just wind. Their story didn't belong to paper. It lived in the small moments, the brush of hands, the shared laughter, the quiet evenings by the fire. When Eli grew older, his hair turning silver like frost on morning grass, he still carved wooden figures. On the mantel above their hearth sat two birds, one slightly worn, the other newer, both facing the same direction. Clara often dusted them with care, remembering how those birds had been his way of saying what words never could. The years were kind to them, though time eventually took what time always does. When Eli passed, it was in the spring, the window open, the creek singing softly nearby. Clara held his hand until the end, whispering, "From now till the end of every winter," just as he had promised long ago. Afterward, she stayed in the valley, her hair white, her heart full. The townspeople visited often, children listening wide-eyed as she told stories of the cowboy who rode through the storm to save her, and how love, real love, doesn't fade when the snow melts. It only grows deeper with the years. When Clara herself was gone, they buried her beside Eli, beneath a tall aspen tree by the creek. On their headstone, simple words were carved. He saved her life. She gave him a reason to live. And beneath that, a small engraving. Two wooden birds, wings outstretched, forever flying together. To this day, locals still tell their story when the first snow falls in Clearwater Valley. They say if you stand by the tracks on a winter night, you can still hear a train whistle in the distance and see two figures walking hand in hand through the snow toward the cabin where love once made history.